William Faulkner fans rejoice because today I'm going to share 3 beautiful quotes from Faulkner on when to stop writing, on titles, and on dialect. And if you don't already know, Right Conscious is the headquarters of everything related to William Faulkner here on YouTube. If you look at the playlist down below, you will find videos on Faulkner's life, his books, and on his writing philosophy. And I've decided to combine these 3 quotes because they are very short, but I think all go together in a nice cohesive message. So let us now hop into the first one. Quote, "The only rule I have is to quit while it's still hot. Never write yourself out. Always quit when it's going good. Then it's easier to take it up again. If you exhaust yourself, then you'll get into a dead spell and you'll have trouble with it. It's what's the saying? Leave them while you are looking good." And this is very similar advice to Faulkner's contemporary, Ernest Hemingway. But what I find interesting about this isn't the advice, but rather the application of it as boots on the ground authors who are still alive in the modern world. Because unlike Hemingway, unlike Faulkner, we do not have unlimited time to write. We do not maybe have the ability to brush off our husband or wife or our kids and go into the study and spend 6+ hours every single day in there, whether writing or not writing, like Hemingway's case in his later years. So practically most of us have at most 2 hours, maybe 4 hours a day to actually write. And 90% of you don't even have a writing routine out there. So I will probably put that number a lot closer to 2 hours. And so if you hear me on this channel pointing to the books behind me and saying that almost every single one of them had someone put 3,000 to 10,000 hours of deep work into them, plus had the help of an amazing editor, then it may seem somewhat daunting every single day when you sit down and you may be like, dude, I have to get some writing done right now. Like, I can't sit and stop in the middle of a sentence when I feel like things are going good. But advice stems from something we've all experienced as authors that, for instance, this morning I rolled out of bed and I was working on a Rilke translation. And I was a bit groggy and I already had the literal translation down and now I was trying to make the work more poetic. Like I was actually doing the writing part of it. And all the changes I made in the first 30 to 45 minutes were absolute trash. And none of them made it to the final draft because it wasn't until I was able to get into an emotional state, into that like kind of writing zone, where I was then able to kind of bring the energy I needed to the piece of work. But what makes writing a novel very interesting is that you are living in that piece of energy, in that work. You are working on it hopefully every single day or multiple times a week. And so you get the vibe, you get the energy, and it's almost a form of pattern recognition. And so it's much easier to find your way back to the flow because every single poem I translate has a different energy signature. So I think this advice is stemming from Faulkner knowing that if you are very serious about your novel and working on it every day and you leave it at a point where you can hop right back into it, that it will reduce the time spent, if not just get rid of it completely, where you're trying to attune yourself to that emotional state. But for most of us who unfortunately aren't living in the world of our novel all the time because of the different switches we have to make every single day, from family man to working out to having to work my job, having to do menial tasks around the house, the energy can somewhat be lost. It isn't a coincidence that many of the best authors of all time either were single and very messy, like in the case of David Foster Wallace or Cormac McCarthy, or had wives or the money to basically get rid of a lot of the unnecessary obligations out there. But something that I recommend everybody do throughout the day is what I call writing for the trash, where the best way to get into that emotional state is to write knowing that what you're going to do is going to suck and just throw it away. Write about anything for 30 minutes, something that's going to kind of get you going. And you could do this throughout the day if you're not writing in the morning. If you're writing on your lunch break, for instance, while you are at work, you could go to the bathroom and just type for 2 minutes on your phone a random story or something about your story or about anything. And you're kind of warming yourself up throughout the day. And if you could sit down and do that for around 20 or 30 minutes, then it's actually a really good way to just put yourself right back into that emotional state where you can attune to anything. Another thing that you can do, I know that some people out there do, is that if you have a very boring job or a job that doesn't require necessarily too much thinking, is that you could write for the trash in the sense of thinking for the entire day what you are going to write when you sit back down. And so let's say you leave off not on a high point, but just on a normal point. But then the next day at work or while you are out, you're just constantly thinking what's going to come next. And so that's actually going to create that emotional clearing. So then when you get back into it, you're going to have a couple paragraphs most likely already thought out. And so then in that flow, then hopefully that transition back to you being in the flow state will be better. And so these are practical tips that over the course of years of you writing your novel will actually add up to you finishing it faster and maybe it being better. Because something I see so many people do, and I think that it's why there's so much bad writing out there, is that once again, they have an insane life like we all do, and they sit down and they just write 1 hour a day or 2 hours a day. And I can feel it sometimes. I almost get jolted where there's a scene and then suddenly the energy is totally different or just something unconsciously happens. And we've all seen it in our own writing before. And even if the reader isn't consciously processing it, they for sure unconsciously are. So there are 2 practical tips, writing for the trash or thinking in your head all day about your writing, that should help you bring a little bit more cohesion. So next we have a quote from Faulkner on titles. And he says, "I doubt if there can be any rule about long titles. I think that anything, the shorter it's said, the better. I think that the story's titles themselves quite often, yes. And that anything, the shorter it's said, the better it is." So I don't know if this is from Faulkner's time in Hollywood, because if you think about it, there's been a trend for a long time of one-word titles. Inception, Argo, Crash, Gladiator, The Titanic, Braveheart, The Unforgiven, Platoon. With books, it's a little bit harder. We have Emma, Dracula, Frankenstein, even though Frankenstein's actually got a huge title. Beloved by Toni Morrison, Kindred by Octavia Butler, a lot of the Shakespeare stuff. But if you look at Faulkner's titles, his longest one is If I Forget Thee, Jerusalem. Most of his titles are 2 or 3 words. And so I think that any kind of hard, fast rule or rule about this stuff is kind of dumb. But if you do not have the ability to understand marketing or what people want, it's better most of the time to do something shorter and more recognizable. What really blew my mind about titles is that when I went to the Cormac McCarthy archive, there was endless arguments about the titles. There must have been 7 letters for The Orchard Keeper where they were just arguing about these crazy titles. And finally, they worked out like we need to come up with something simple and catchy. And even though The Orchard Keeper wasn't some success, in retrospect, when I look at some of the other titles, which were really trippy and really crazy, it was the best one. The Orchard Keeper, Outer Dark, Child of God, Suttree. And this isn't that big of a problem, but in the self-publishing world, occasionally I do see a title that's way too long and insane. And I see plenty of titles that most likely aren't very well thought out. And this is kind of one of the problems with not having an editor or having a group of people around you, because something you can do if you get on Substack.com, where the literary renaissance is happening, the best writers in the world are over on Substack, including myself. I share my own writing over there. I do a book club. I do literature and writing courses. You can find all of that in the link down in the description below. But over on Substack, I've helped dozens of authors get hundreds of readers. And I know a lot of those authors. And having access to even 100 people you could ask, which one do you like better, Title A or Title B? Almost all of them are going to respond to you. And you could run through as many split tests as you wanted with the title. Which one sounds more interesting? Same with covers. And so all these, most likely your title idea is garbage, because none of Cormac McCarthy's first title ideas were the ones that ended up getting published. And we're talking about Cormac McCarthy. I mean, there are countless other authors too I could give examples for. It was a collaborative process with someone, sometimes with a team of people. Sometimes people got ideas from other people, from their wife or whoever, and that's how they came to it. So these are these little pieces of nuance, the title, the typography, that actually requires a lot of research and experimentation that separates the people that get at least a little traction and the people who don't. Because personally, if I don't see a great looking title and a great looking cover, then I'm not going to buy the book. I'm not even going to attempt to read it. I know what a $1,000 cover looks like. I know what a Canva cover looks like, someone who has some design skills and did it themselves. And if you don't believe in your book enough to at least hire a professional to do a cover for you on something that you spent 5,000 hours on, hopefully, then I don't think you actually spent 5,000 hours on it. Same with thinking through the title, same with some of the other elements of the novel. I know it's a bit harsh, but every book is a legacy piece of work for you, unless you're planning to release 80 books in your life. And even if you are, they are still a part of your legacy. And our last quote of the day is on dialect. And Faulkner says, I think best to use as little dialects as possible because it confuses people who are not familiar with it. That nobody should let the character speak completely in his own vernacular. It's best indicated by a few simple, sparse, but recognizable touches. And Faulkner, who writes sometimes insane prose, complicated prose, follows this rule pretty well. And Cormac McCarthy, who was his Faulkner's successor, followed this through pretty well. If you look at Judge Holden and Glanton and the dialogue in there, there are some touches of the dialect of the modern time, but in general, they're just speaking like how you and I are speaking. You know, even if you think about the hermit at the start of Blood Meridian and that whole conversation, that dude was a former slave owner. He wasn't talking in some crazy Southern dialect. In Cormac McCarthy's masterpiece, Suttree, there is a fair amount of dialect, but it is somewhat sparse, and there are a lot of sections between it where you understand what's going on, or it's more complicated on a literary and prose and symbolic level. And I think that's where you really should be showing off your skills and working with the reader, because as I talked about in a different video, David Foster Wallace in Infinite Jest attempted to write from the point of view of an illiterate Black girl from Boston, which is already a crazy dialect, that was living in the projects in poverty, whose uncle or someone was raping her and she was pregnant and hormonal. How do you study for that? How do you try to do that authentically? And I think he failed in just even trying to get somewhat close to what that could sound like, but you're just setting yourself up to fail. And even if you succeed, like let's say that section was perfect, it would still be a WTF for everybody. Like what? Obviously, if you can pull off dialects really well and use Southern dialects like Toni Morrison does and other people, then it's very strong. And, you know, Toni Morrison, I think, would push back against Faulkner and say that whitewashing isn't the right word because he's writing about white people most of the time, but that you're taking the flavor, you're taking what makes the South away from the work to make it easier from others. But, you know, I agree more with Faulkner, but I think there is room for geniuses or people who are really experienced to do vernacular works. And it's really fun to be able to read. You know, and if you look, it's important, you know, if you look at Dante and in his use of vernacular and its influence on the creation of the Italian language, if you look at Boccaccio's The Decameron and then how that influenced Chaucer, who wrote in vernacular some of the time of the people, and then how Chaucer influenced Shakespeare and how Shakespeare influenced everything in our reality. You know, if it wasn't for Chaucer taking that risk, you know, and what's interesting about Chaucer is that he never released his work to the people. You know, he was this clerk. He was a stowaway artist managing the docks like Frank Sabacca. So there you have it, you guys. I have a guide down below of all of William Faulkner's known influences for those that are interested, and my preferred reading guide for experienced readers or people who are just getting into literature. And so if you guys want to go into William Faulkner, all you have to do, I should say get, not go, into William Faulkner. All you have to do is click on the link down below, get the guide, and hopefully that will save you some time in terms of getting to the right book for you without having to go through something too easy or too hard. And so hope you guys have a good Monday, and I will see you very soon in the next video.